Hello and welcome to ID Talk, answers from an infectious disease expert. I'm Dr. Sean Elliott, a pediatric infectious disease specialist with Tucson Medical Center, Professor Emeritus of Pediatrics at the University of Arizona College of Medicine, and leader at the Arizona chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. This podcast has been created to answer questions from our chapter's members about the COVID-19 pandemic. This is the first week of February, and as I record, this is February 2nd of the year 2021. Globally, there are over 103.3 million cases of COVID-19 and over 2.23 million deaths. In the United States, as we all know, there's over 26.3 million cases and over 443,000 deaths. In kids specifically, and this is based on AAP data coming to us from January 28th cumulatively, there have been 2.8 million cases, which represents 12.8% of the total number of cases in the states. That comes out to a case number of 3,742 per 100,000 cases. In Arizona specifically, we have a cumulative number of 116,425 cases since the start of the pandemic, and this accounts for 15.8% of our total cases. Our numbers come out to 6,332 per 100,000 pediatric cases, and we are one of 6 states which has a number greater than 6,000. So Arizona, both in terms of total cases in adults and pediatrics and in pediatrics, is at the top of the country. Our cumulative number of deaths related to COVID-19 is up to 22. This, unfortunately, is number 3 in the nation, following only New York City with 23 and Texas 37. Note that these are cumulative. This is not a per N or per denominator ratio. And knowing that New York specifically and Texas have far greater numbers, this is not a good sign. So Arizona's experience, as you all well know, with COVID-19 has been rather grim for pediatrics. So this week's, or these 2 weeks' questions have a lot to do with the impact of the mutants, the mutant variants which are out there, and very appropriately, because that is probably the hottest news right now. First question is a great way to get us started. Could I please explain the mechanism of the mutation of the coronavirus? And are there any criteria for who might be at risk for these variants? Well, just like other viruses, and I think influenza, especially influenza A, is a very good model for this, all living things undergo a normal amount of spontaneous mutations. In human beings, as I record this podcast, each of us will undergo millions of DNA point mutations, a specific element of DNA, either code or sometimes even all the way down to an amino acid full code, will change spontaneously. The important thing in human beings is that we have a proofreading mechanism which repairs these mutated mistakes so that we don't have any overt escalation of mutations while we live. That is not true in most viruses, and especially not in influenza A. It also appears to be not true for SARS coronavirus 2, so that normally occurring spontaneous mutations or point mutations in single amino acids can occur and remain fixed. Now, as you would imagine, statistically, many of these mutations are occurring in non-coding parts of the DNA or RNA, depending on the organism. But those that do occur in a code, in a specific set of amino acid sequences, which codes for a specific ultimate protein, will have impact at some point in time. A single point mutation by itself likely does not have a major impact. And that is what has been largely emerging from the start of the pandemic. The very first mutant variant, the D614G, was a change from D to G at a single point in the code for the spike protein. As you would imagine, as a single protein change, or a single amino acid change, there was not a major impact. Although even that mutant virus, which is the principal strain right now in the world, was a little bit easier to be transmitted. And that likely is because that mutation occurred in a critical part of the binding element, by which the virus responds to and binds to its ACE2 receptor in respiratory epithelial tissue. So fast forward then to today, where we have at least 3 significant circulating strains of mutant variants, those being from the United Kingdom, the B.1.1.7, and additional isolates from South Africa and now from Brazil, all 3 of which have been demonstrated here in the United States. So that's the process, and each of the 3 new variants has not just one point mutation, but, as expected with a passage of time, an accumulation of significant point mutations. Ultimately, when enough of these occur in a specific code for a specific gene for a specific protein, then there will be a conformational change, and that virus will phenotypically, meaning by its appearance, mutate. This is the concept behind antigenic shift, which is why we have to have a new influenza vaccine every year. So that same thing is happening, albeit much more slowly, with the SARS coronavirus 2, and we are simply playing out in real time, the impact of that. So what does that mean in terms of the virus itself? So far, the mutant variants, with their conformational changes in parts of the spike protein, are more contagious. That means they're binding more readily to the ACE2 receptor. And here's where things are turning into the hypothetical. It's unclear what impact that truly has. For example, a virus which binds more strongly to its target respiratory epithelium may be able to infect that person more readily and allow for a higher viral load occurring in that person. Now, so far, the clinical evidence is that these patients are no sicker and that the virus is no more deadly or virulent than any other virus. However, if they are getting a higher viral load just from their infection, then they can transmit a higher viral load in their respiratory secretions, thus giving to the observation that these viruses appear to be more contagious. In fact, the South African variant is up to 50% more contagious. That's a concern because what might have been previously unlikely populations to transmit virus, our patients, like kids, may now become more likely to be contagious. So all the former population studies and all the former bets are off in terms of who might be contagious when. So who's at increased risk for the variants? All of us, including our pediatric patients. What remains to be seen is how readily or how robustly the new variants will gain a toehold here in the United States. How are these being discovered? Well, it takes a genotyping event to look at the genotype, the RNA makeup of the virus, which is not something which a normal commercial lab will be performing. Instead, these are being done by virology labs with their various genotyping mechanisms. And I won't bore you with the science, but suffice it to say that there are virology labs around the country in multiple states that are sequencing the RNA genomes of these viruses as they come through. That means that A, you have to find an infected person with the mutant. B, you have to grow the virus in a reporter's cell line or lineage. And then C, you have to have the ability, the mechanism to do the genome typing. So that is occurring at individual spots around the country, and those individual spots are indeed discovering mutant variants. Here again is where things break down a bit into the hypothetical. Some of the patients who have been demonstrated to have what appears to be, for example, the South African variant, have zero travel history. So where do they get infected? Were they exposed to somebody who did have a travel history? Or was the combination of spontaneous mutations occurring in South Africa occurring also in parallel but separately here in the States? Too early to tell, but just so we know, there are these variants circulating, and we can anticipate that to increase. The big news here, and this of course leads into another question, is are the current vaccines still able to protect us against the mutant variants? So far, the answer is yes, but that's a so far. For example, the 2 messenger RNA vaccines which we're currently distributing in the States, those being the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, have been tested against the existing circulating variant mutant strains so far and have been found to be effective. Less so than against the current circulating wild type or what actually is a mutant itself, the D614G strain. But the 2 messenger RNA vaccines are still effective. Other vaccines that are being produced and slowly being licensed in other parts of the world, for example, the Janssen Pharmaceuticals, a subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson, and the AstraZeneca products, both of those also have continued efficacy against the variant strains, but also with decreased efficacy. So far, somebody who's vaccinated may be protected against the variant strains. The challenge is that we are in an arms race, quite honestly, a race against time and a race against nature. The longer that we go globally and nationally with robust numbers of circulating virus infecting people, the higher the likelihood that a mutant strain will emerge, and it will, it's a matter of time, which has enough conformational changes in the spike protein antigen recognition site, which is what is recognized by antibodies formed by the vaccines, that we will have a variant strain which is resistant to the antibodies created to the vaccines. It's a matter of time. So the sooner that we can get everybody and their moms, quite literally, vaccinated, the sooner we can decrease the circulating viral load, the circulating numbers of people who are becoming infected, and decrease the ecological pressure in nature for a mutant virus to emerge, which will require yet another set of vaccines. So fingers crossed that that occurs quite readily. The next question then, again, is a very appropriate one. In light of the newer, more deadly strain of COVID, are cloth masks enough? So a couple points of clarity here, that the mutant variant strains are not themselves more deadly, nor are they more virulent, right? If you were to look at a person infected with, for example, the South African variant, they would not be any more likely to die from complications of COVID-19 than somebody with the D614G, which is what we currently have mostly in the States. Instead, what you're hearing, and this I think was a misinterpretation by the news media of something that the great Dr. Tony Fauci have said, as more people are infected more readily, more rapidly, and more easily with the variant strain, there will be higher numbers of people with comorbidities who are at greater risk of normal, if you will, complications from COVID-19. And so there will be potentially more people dying with COVID-19 as more of them get infected. So that's an important point of clarification that I think will help us as I'm sure we entertain questions from our patients and their parents. That said, do we need to change our masking strategy? The answer is no. And this is important that there's a news story circulating, again, thank you to the media, out of the East Coast where an emergency medicine physician was quoted as saying, we should all be wearing double masks. Major misquote. What that individual was referring to was those of us in a clinical setting when we're wearing an N95 mask and then using a surgical mask on the top of that to preserve the efficacy of the N95 mask for longer. That's appropriate for those of us who are healthcare providers, but that is not a reasonable common recommendation to our patients. Instead, the mask which we continue and should continue to recommend for the population, for the community, is to satisfy the first and primary role, and that is to prevent droplet transmission from the mask wearer to anybody else. And in that regard, cloth masks remain effective. Why are we not using cloth masks in a hospital setting? I mean, most of us who have exposure to an in-hospital setting are required to wear surgical masks. The major reason is that not all cloth masks are created equally, and not every single one has been tested in terms of transmissibility by the national standard licensing organizations. The surgical masks have. So reasonably, a cloth mask, especially one which is now purchased commercially, which has more than a single thin layer of fabric, is going to be as effective against the variant strains as it is against the current circulating strain. So yes, the cloth masks for everybody else are enough. And this is a very important caveat which the questioner also adds, provided they fit well. Yeah, absolutely. No mask is going to work if it's not being worn properly, to wit, the mask below the nose, or the mask above the mouth, or the mask which is very loose and gaping at the sides. So yes, any mask, regardless of cloth versus surgical versus fabric versus N95, needs to fit well and to be worn properly. Okay, so if a member of the public then wants to purchase N95 masks, how can they be assured that they are buying a quality product? And on a related question, is there a big difference between an N95 and a KN95? So here we need to look at the national licensing organizations, all of which are subsidiaries of the CDC. So the CDC is sort of the parent organization which provides appropriate licensing and evaluation of efficacy utility of all of our medical interventions. It is followed then by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, or NIOSH, or NIOSH, as some people have said. And you may have seen NIOSH certifications on masks which you're purchasing for your practices or for the hospital setting or wherever you are. And indeed, that's appropriate. So NIOSH is the official certification agency, but it is basing its certification on yet another subsidiary, this time of NIOSH, which is the National Personal Protective Laboratory, NPPTL. So basically, studies are performed on, in this case, masks, looking at the rate of transmission of particles through the mask. The reason N95 is that it allows only 5% of particulate matters greater than 3 microns through it. So it prevents 95% of the transmission, N95. And that's a very effective laboratory standard, and any NIOSH or NPPTL certified N95 mask here in the States is going to have passed those tests. It'll be effective, it's reasonable, it's a good recommendation for our patients and parents if they wish to obtain one of those. Here again, though, the key is that that mask fits well. So obviously, I think most of us know they come in small, sometimes medium and large. And anybody, such as myself, who has facial hair needs to keep the facial hair trimmed very, very short, and in a goatee so that the mask can get a good seal around the nose and the mouth. All of us, obviously working in a hospital setting, undergo annual fit testing for the N95 masks to protect us from, for example, tuberculosis or varicella in a patient who has active chickenpox or shingles. So the NIOSH certification is part of the scene, but so too is instruction how to wear the fit testing. Now here's the difference between N95 and KN95. N95 is the United States certification process. KN95 is the Chinese certification process. And these are studies performed by the manufacturer under direction of either the U.S. government or the Chinese government to pass the standards identified. The standards are still the same. They still need to prevent 95% of particulate matter from transmitting across the mask. And that the mechanisms, the logistics of testing that are identical. So, if you have a KN95 mask, especially if it has been NIOSH certified, additionally, that is a reasonable mask to recommend to your patients if they can obtain one, even despite the fact that it has been initially certified by the Chinese government. One additional component of the KN95 as part of the Chinese standardization process is that those masks are required to pass fit testing, unlike the United States masks. So you may anecdotally have discovered the KN95 is a bit easier to mold to your face and you feel like you get a better seal around that mask. That actually may be true because those masks are designed and required to be better in terms of fit testing. They have to pass that standard, unlike in the States. On the other hand, in the States, the fabrics used have to pass standards for breathability, meaning the amount of air coming in and being expired. So you may feel that it's a bit easier to breathe in a N95, a United States certified mask, than in a KN95. Honestly, it all breaks down to personal preference and how best to attain that fit and the wearability of the mask. If either has an N95 or KN95 status and is NIOSH certified here in the States, either is a great recommendation for ourselves and also for our patients. Okay, moving on. If someone had COVID-19 and now has antibodies, can they still carry and spread the virus to others even with the antibodies? This is a very important question, and it pertains not just to individuals who were infected with actual virus, who had COVID-19 clinical disease, but also those of us who have been immunized. Because you would say, well, gosh, I've got antibodies. I'm no longer able to get infected, so I should be safe, right? Unfortunately, not true. First of all, as we well know, people who have been infected and had clinical COVID-19, especially if their first episode was mild, do have the ability to become reinfected. That's why we recommend, and the CDC recommends, vaccinating those individuals regardless of their prior COVID-19 status. So too with those who are vaccinated. The vaccines that we currently are administering, the messenger RNA vaccines, are 95 and 94% effective. That's pretty darn good. You might argue that leaves 5 and 6% of us who don't have complete protection. And even with that, it honestly doesn't matter because both vaccines are 100% effective at preventing escalation to severe disease. So why then do we still wear masks if we're pretty darn well protected against getting disease or secondary disease? It has to do with the virus itself. The virus, remember, binds to respiratory epithelium, i.e. the nasopharynx, your upper respiratory tree, by binding to those ACE2 receptors. The vaccine does not do anything to prevent that binding. All the vaccine prevents is activation of disease or replication of the virus after that binding event. So theoretically, if I were fully vaccinated and I walked into a COVID-19 patient's room without personal protective equipment, I could acquire virus binding to my nose, a small amount. It would hopefully not turn into disease and not increase the viral load, but my respiratory secretions would still contain that small amount of virus and theoretically be contagious to a susceptible individual, such as an older family member, an immunocompromised person, certainly another patient in hospital. So the recommendation currently is based on that theoretic concern that masks need to continue to be worn for anybody regardless of their infection status or their vaccination status. And that will continue to be true until we eventually get on top of this pandemic and the total circulating amount of virus, meaning, contagious viral particles in a community, decreases significantly. Only then, when the global viral load is very low, can we come out from behind those masks and see each other's smiles. So it's going to come. It is absolutely going to come, hopefully, perhaps by this coming summer, but we have a long ways to go yet. Okay, let's see. What other questions do we have? I think we've got that one. Okay, yeah, so I guess the last one on my list, can I give some talking points for our families, our patients, regarding the safety of the vaccine for our kids age 16 and up? Keeping in mind that the Pfizer vaccine was safety tested in age 16 and up, the Moderna vaccine was safety tested in 18 and up. Both vaccines now have trials recruiting 12 years of age and up. And Dr. Fauci is predicting that we may be getting data for even younger children by the summer. So hopefully this will become a real conversation going forward, and the ability to vaccinate school children, both adolescents as well as middle school and maybe even elementary age kids by the summer. So how do we then help our parents and our kids understand the safety of the vaccine and the necessity of the vaccine? To understand that, I guess we have to understand what some of the common complaints are or concerns are about the vaccines. And the current circulating ones, that the messenger RNA vaccines, of course, are novel technology. And anything new, of course, is going to invite concerns about safety. It's not unreasonable. However, the technology, the science behind a messenger RNA vaccine is not novel. It is not new. And in fact, the science has been live for the last 10 years plus. In fact, early Ebola virus vaccines also were looked to incorporate the messenger RNA approach. And in the primate studies, the phase 1 studies even, they were found to be safe and effective. And we have historic precedents looking at a lack of bizarre human mutant zombies walking around causing apocalypse. So the initial safety studies on other vaccines using the same technology have been universally safe. That's the first part. The second part then is a better understanding of what actually happens with the messenger RNA vaccine. And unlike, I think the public perception that we're injecting DNA into people's bloodstream to where they'll become mutants, Instead, we're injecting messenger RNA, and I know this is a hail back to our initial biology days, but it's a very small code for a very specific part of the virus, and not even anywhere near the whole virus. It's just the spike protein. And that code then is taken up by antigen-presenting cells at the site of the injection, that lovely sore muscle or deltoid, which all of us experienced. And there, it inserts itself or gets itself transcribed eventually into DNA and eventually into protein. So there is no possibility of taking over the human genome, of altering the human DNA, because the messenger RNA is transcribed directly into code for amino acids and a protein. Also, the messenger RNA itself does not hang around very long. It is a foreign material which is ingested by a healthy, intact immune system. And that actually means that injection that we give has been consumed and processed typically within 24 hours, if not even shorter. And there certainly is no circulating messenger RNA for other parts of the body. This is why we continue to maintain that it is safe for nursing mothers to breastfeed or to express breast milk, because there's no chance of messenger RNA expressing itself into the breast milk. And similarly, there's no chance for the human body to mutate or to acquire mutant code because of this. The transcription translation process is occurring within the cytoplasm of the antigen-presenting cells. Protein is being made and is being expressed directly to the immune system. That's it. There's no entering or fixation into human DNA. So at least the science would suggest that there are no even potential or theoretic adverse effects from the vaccine itself. What about the concerns that people have reactions to the viruses, to the vaccines? Well, a little bit of reaction is appropriate. That means that one's immune system is having a good vaccine take. And I think all of us has viewed this argument. Would you prefer to be feeling ill or tired or achy for a day, or would you prefer to be that way for 3 or 4 weeks and then die from COVID-19? Sorry to be blunt, but that's what it boils down to. And there's also the personal responsibility pledge. Truly, our pediatric patients are not likely to have severe disease, but some do. There is certainly a continued rate and attack concern of developing multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children, MISCI, or even hyperimmune COVID-19, both of which are still landing children and adolescents into intensive care units. I cared for one just last week. So there is still a risk to our pediatric patients that is being avoided by and mitigated by vaccines. So there are the safety issue talking points we can discuss. There's the personal responsibility pledge to protect family members, grandma, grandpa, tia, nana, tia, tata, etc. And then there's also the personal safety issues. Ultimately, I hope and I think, just like other people who have concerns and questions about vaccines, it'll be a conversation, hearing the questions, not dismissing the questions, of course. We all know how to do this conversation, answering them as best they can, and then it'll ultimately be a shared decision-making model to come in with the expectation the child will be vaccinated, and then to address any concerns they have about that. That is where we stand, folks. Lots more to be said. I think, again, the biggest news item has to be the race between mutant viruses out there, and I don't mean to paint a grim picture at all, but simply to recognize that nature is really good at circumventing what we as our puny human beings think that we're doing. So that the faster that we can get people immunized, and I know there's a lot of pressure, and I know personally speaking, I definitely know there are logistical concerns in getting enough vaccines delivered to enough vaccine sites to deliver the vaccine to necessary needing people. All these things, of course, are being worked on and need to be worked on expediently. So we are in a race against time. And anything that I can do to help answer your questions, and anything that we can do as pediatric healthcare providers in the state of Arizona to increase the numbers of vaccine recipients is going to be for the greater good. Absolutely. So with that, thank you for listening to ID Talk. Arizona AAP members can submit questions for future episodes to covid@azaap.org. For more information and resources related to COVID-19 in Arizona, or to learn how to become a member, please visit us at azaap.org. Until then, and in the meanwhile, stay safe, people. Stay safe, passionate, and sane. Blessings to you all.